Modern life. Between careers, kids, and health, it can be mayhem. That's why we're here. I'm Dr. Lisa Varghese-Kroll.
And I'm Dr. Lurie Falusi. We're physicians, moms, and longtime friends who break it all down for you. Wondering how to juggle all the balls and still stay sane? Looking for advice but don't want to be overwhelmed?
Curious about how to make the most out of life for your family but enjoy it at the same time? You're in the right place. Welcome to Health and Home with the Hippocratic hosts. On this episode, we share part 2 of a 2-part series on race, racism, and health. Today, we're talking to pediatrician and researcher Dr. Nia Heard-Garris about talking to kids about racism, why it's important, how to maintain momentum, and where on earth to start. Hey, Lurie.
Hey, Lisa. What a month.
Yes, you said it.
Right. I'm so excited, though, about today's episode, which is the next part of our series on race and health. We have all been inundated with news of racial inequity and injustice recently, but still, it can be hard to know how to talk about it in our daily lives.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to this discussion as well. I think we're all going to benefit. Now, I think that, you think that, but not everyone necessarily thinks that. So let's talk about it. Why is it important to talk about race and racism with our kids and other loved ones? Well, Lurie and I live in the United States, so we're going to use the United States as an example here. But as we all know, this is applicable around the world. So speaking about the U.S., over the past few years, and especially since the 2016 presidential election, it's become clear to almost all Americans that their country is more polarized than it has ever been in recent history. And that polarization is increasing. But that polarization must be addressed. Even setting aside the reality that conflicts often lead to physical violence, which is reason enough to do something about it, the fact is that Americans are sharing one country. We are all sitting in one car, and that car can't be driven in 2 directions.
So true.
Right? It's, a nation must have common ground and common goals, or it won't survive as a nation. I mean, history's shown us this time and again. But the problem is, to paraphrase Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, that racism is infecting this country like stage 4 cancer, and it's metastasizing. We cannot treat the symptoms, which are things like injustices like police brutality or academic opportunity gaps. We can't just treat those and expect to recover. We have to treat the cause. And for generations, it's been largely the Black community and other people of color who've been speaking out on their own. And that's just not enough. And without the support of all good people, anti-racism, justice, and peace are unattainable. But, in our polarized world, it's pretty easy to stay in a media bubble.
Oh, yes. Sad but true.
Consuming only those articles and social media posts that confirm that we were right, confirm our existing opinions. So, how do we reach each other? Studies show that people are much more likely to change their opinion if a trusted family member or friend discusses an issue with them. And that's why having these uncomfortable and even painful discussions is so important. It may be the only chance we have of reaching that common ground and achieving justice for all.
Absolutely. And that's why we are thrilled to have with us today someone who is an expert in having these tough but necessary conversations. Our guest today is Dr. Nia Heard-Garris, a pediatrician and researcher at Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago and in the Department of Pediatrics at Northwestern University, Feinberg School of Medicine. She examines the influence of social adversities experienced in childhood, including the impact of racism on subsequent child and adult health. Dr. Heard-Garris is an active member in the American Academy of Pediatrics, or AAP, and she serves as the chair and founding member of the AAP's section on minority health, equity, and inclusion. And you have been busy educating the public on how to talk with kids about race and racism.
Yes, our favorite interview so far has definitely been the CNN Town Hall with Sesame Street characters that you participated in. The questions from the kids and of course from Elmo, they were just incredible.
Right. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Heard-Garris.
I am so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I've been busy and a little tired, but I think it is worthy cause, obviously.
And we are honored. And I have to say, so I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Heard-Garris in the same clinic years ago, and I can attest to how passionate you are about helping children thrive, even when they're in difficult circumstances.
Oh, well, I mean, I think the pleasure was mine to be able to work with you and learn from you. I still think you're the best pediatrician in the game.
All right, I will pay you for that later. So thank you so much. You're too kind. So let's get to that. All right, so there is a movement, as we all know, to be more open and more bold in the way that we talk about race and racism, especially with children. And the reality is we have to, right? Studies show that babies can recognize differences in skin color as early as 3 months old. So it's never too early to talk about race. And of course, Black families and other communities of color have been talking about this for years, really out of survival, while others may have had the luxury of trying to preserve their kids' innocence around the reality of racism. So for our first question for you then is, for parents who have not talked explicitly about racism with their kids, but are ready to do that now, what would you recommend for starting those conversations? Like, how do you actually raise a child to be anti-racist?
Ooh, so right out the gate, we're starting off with tough questions. Thanks.
That's how we roll.
I love it. Oh, my
We
goodness.
trust you can handle it.
I think that it's a good question. I think, firstly, I would say thank you to those parents that haven't had those conversations traditionally, but are having and wanting to have those conversations now, because I know it's not easy, especially for white families that have not talked about this at all. I mean, it would be for Black families, this conversation, and for other people of color, this conversation is not new. So as you mentioned, but for many white families around the country and the world, really, this is a very new conversation. It's uncharted territory. It feels uncomfortable. You're afraid you're going to make a mistake. So thank you for being bold and taking that step to talk to your kids first and foremost. I think secondly, it really depends on your kid's age, and not just their age, but their maturity, what they're understanding, how they can kind of synthesize all the information you want to tell them. You wouldn't get on the soapbox with a 5-year-old and tell them about the whole entire history of the country. Like, their attention span is just not long enough. You want to give them short, snippets of information, and it shouldn't be a one-off. So it should be a conversation that you have, throughout the year, throughout their time that they're growing up. It's an evolving conversation that you build on. But similarly, with a teenager, you don't want to just give them a 5-second conversation. You want to give them some context about how America was built, how slaves were brought over and captured, and, all kinds of the atrocities that happened to build this country, giving them some more kind of context and history around it. So they're not like, well, things were fine yesterday. What happened to our world? So I think context is super, super important. And then your question about how do you raise an anti-racist kid? I think primarily you yourself have to be anti-racist, right?
So
and
true.
that is a hard thing. It's not something that, again, you wake up and overnight you're going to be anti-racist because you read 3 books about it. Yeah. It's really something that you practice and you're striving for daily. And I think we teach our kids through our attitudes and our behaviors, even the stuff we're not directly saying, but our indirect kind of attitudes, how we act, how we interact with others. Kids are seeing that first. So that's really their first introduction to anti-racism 101.
So, along those lines, parents often strive to be good role models for their children. I mean, I think most of us do. But sometimes the other adults around us are not on the same page when it comes to how we think and talk about race. So what recommendations do you have for people when their in-laws or parents of their kids' friends or anyone else around them makes a racist remark, especially when these are people who you want to call out, but you also need to maintain a good relationship with them?
Ooh, again, another tough question. I mean, I think that this is such an important question because especially for white people, because there's going to be so many spaces that Black and brown folks don't really have the privilege of being in, even very personal, intimate spaces. So let's talk about Thanksgiving dinner or, and comments will be made. And it's first you have to get over the cringe factor that you're having in the moment, Uncle so-and-so, Aunt so-and-so, whoever has said something, and you're like, oh, did they just say that? So you have to let yourself have that emotion because it'll probably happen. And especially, oh my gosh, did they just say that in front of my children? Especially when I'm trying so hard to have these conversations, to really, talk about racism and nip bias in the bud and all that stuff, right? But then I think you have to call it out. And I think there are ways to do it that will help to disarm people so that they're not immediately defensive and you're going kind of back and forth in this tit for tat over the Thanksgiving dinner, like the least kind of confrontational space that you want to be in. You're trapped in a room, and you can't get out. But I think in order to model that behavior we were talking about of having your children see you be anti-racist when there are things that are not right, you have to try to be bold and courageous and speak out about them, or those things will never change. And I think it's difficult because you fear, right? You're fearful of like what this could do to your relationship potentially. You're
Absolutely.
fearful for ridicule and that somebody might turn it on you and say, "Oh, you're such a snowflake," or "You're so." PC or whatever the thing may be, that you could become the object of that person's kind of target or their rage even. So I think you should call it out. And for folks of color who are in that situation, the reality is it may not always be a safe thing to do. And that's why it's so important to have white allies and other people of color that are allies, because sometimes you have to make that decision and say, you know what, this is not safe. This is my boss. This is my partner's mother. This is my whatever. And so those decisions are really important to make. If you're not safe, you're not going to be able to speak out appropriately. But if you do that check and you're saying, I'm over my cringe factor, I feel safe and empowered, to speak out, then you call it and you say, what I hear you saying is this. This is what you said. This is how you're feeling. You said this in front of my children, and I'm trying to teach them X. You said that all black people are XYZ, but really I'm teaching them this because this is what's right. And you can hope to kind of pivot the conversation there. If it's not safe, if it's not a safe place to kind of call somebody out for whatever reason, especially in front of children, I would make sure you go and have that conversation with your child. What Aunt Kathy said, Uncle Bill said was not right. We don't believe that in our house. We don't share those values at all. This is what we believe and this is what we do. And then, try to say to them, if people are talking about these things that make you feel uncomfortable, make sure you come and have a conversation with me, because you want your kids to always try to loop you into tough situations, because they might find themselves in a tough situation like that one day too.
I really like that. I think that is disarming. Sort of say, I hear you saying this, and what I'm trying to teach my child is something else. So you're not saying you're bad or you're wrong, but rather here's what I'm trying to do over here with my child, who you probably love as much as I do. Kind of getting people on the same page. So let's talk about parents raising children of color, especially Black children. And in this time when people, as we're saying, are becoming more motivated to learn more about how to dismantle racism, I think one thing that we don't hear enough about is how to support kids when they see or experience this trauma themselves. And you've written about this, your conversations with your own son. So how do you think we can support children who either maybe they're young and they're just starting to experience racism, or maybe they're older and they're afraid and angry because they see themselves in George Floyd or Breonna Taylor? And to, pile on the hard questions for you, for kids who maybe are not direct targets of racism, how do we teach them their responsibilities as potential bystanders of racist acts?
Yeah, so for kids that you are trying to have these conversations with, whether if they're young or if they're older, I always like to see where kids are. Just for the same reasons we kind of talked about a little bit before. You don't want to talk them and, have lost them and make them really scared. And at the same time, you don't want to underestimate what they know. So I like to start for kids, like, hey, there's been a lot been going on recently. What have you heard or what have you seen? Because even for me, a person who like studies racism, really talks about it and thinks about it a lot, I'm very protective when it comes to my son. And I try really hard to make sure that he's not exposed to the things that I'm not ready for him to see and hear yet. At the same time, he is exposed, even though I try so hard so that he's not watching the news or, whatever. But this is happening. People are talking about this constantly. I mean, we did a Sesame Street whole town hall about this. So it's inescapable. But I don't want to talk so much that I scare him and that he hears things that will not let him sleep at night. And the flip side, if he was a teenager and I was, had the same kitty gloves that I have on right now with him, I think he wouldn't trust me. Like, hey, mom, like things are literally burning down. Like, what are you talking about? So you want to kind of evaluate where your kid is and then speak to them at that level. So I think it's always really important to start there. And I always try to end on a more positive, hopeful note. I tend to be an optimist in general, but I like to talk about, yes, the country does not have a totally flowery history. Yes, there are things and injustices that are happening still right now, but here's what we're going to do about it, or here's what others have done about it. What should we do as a family? What should we do, as a 15-year-old, as a freshman, as a 8th grader, as a 5th grader? Like, what should we do? What's within your sphere of influence to change the world? Because we all have an obligation to make this world better, right? And so what will you do? And kids come up with really creative things to do something. But I think it's hard to have that conversation and leave it, because then you feel helpless and powerless and like, oh my God, it's such a big problem. Like, I don't even want to think about it. It's so bad. It's so scary. I think it's nice to think about action steps to make it better. And I also think, the conversation might be a little different for little Black boys and Black kids and kids of color than white kids, because the conversation that I really need to have with my son is that even though you're dressed nicely, even though, you're minding your business, it still is not always, things aren't always going to come out in your favor, unfortunately. And that's a different conversation than I would think if I had a white son, which would be, if you see some stuff going down and they're harassing your friends, if they're harassing people, you make sure you record it, you speak out, because your safety is a little bit different. How you're perceived is different. So I would hope that would be my conversation. And then just in general, I think what people fail to realize is that, while racism hurts people of color, it hurts Black people, it also hurts those who are bystanders to it. And by bystander, I mean the whole country, from an economic standpoint, but also from a mental health and physical health standpoint. I study vicarious racism. So that's secondhand racism that doesn't happen to you, but you hear about, you witness, your parents have lived through or whatever. It's similar to secondhand smoke. Like, you're not the one smoking, but you're getting all the carcinogens. You're, exposed to lung cancer. It's the same thing for kids, for adults, and for our society, really.
I think that's such an important point. This is affecting everyone, whether we think so or not. So exactly what you said, really thinking about how we're tailoring that conversation to the individual child is so important, because they're part of it. Some of our listeners have jobs that allow them to be in front of kids and families, kids that aren't their own, including some that are in the healthcare field or in education. And you actually started a group within the American Academy of Pediatrics that focuses on minority health and equity and inclusion. So how should we start to talk about racism with our patients or students or clients? And how can we make it standardized so that it's not just a conversation only with the Black people that we encounter?
Absolutely. That is a great point. And I would say that your listeners are super smart people, because they're listening to you too. So they already, They already are on their way. So that's good. That's step one.
Our bill is getting higher, Lonre.
I know. We owe you so much, Nia.
It's so true. It's so true. So I'm glad they're listening to you, first off. But then secondly, if they're members of the American Academy of Pediatrics, certainly join the section of minority health, equity, and inclusion. These conversations are starting to happen. And we're trying to figure out, all of us are trying to figure out, how do we do this in a way that's sensitive? But also, we have other things to do. We, for 20 minutes, we need to do physicals and checkups and vaccines, and we may not be able to spend 20 minutes talking about race. Obviously, this is a very long conversation, but I feel like I've seen people do this really well, and I've tried in my own practice to try to bring it up in a sensitive way. And I think for Black and brown families especially, people have been trying to say, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now with Black Lives Matter and the things that we've seen on TV. How are you doing? I want you to know that, I'm against what's been happening. I'm against racism, and I'm trying to be here to support you. So knowing that you're opening the door for that conversation, right? Because I know a lot of people kind of come into offices and they feel like they can't show their whole selves, right? But if you open the door and say, I'm not, I watch the news, I see what's going on. I want you to know I'm here for you, and I'm a source of help, regardless of what I may look like. But also, I think as far as our learners, we need to educate ourselves. So, AAP has produced a racism policy statement that might be helpful with respect to understanding the evidence that's there. Because you can't really speak to your patients or anybody about, a diagnosis that you don't know, you haven't read about, you haven't heard about. How do you have that conversation if you don't know it yourself? If you've never heard of Lemierre's syndrome, how can you A, diagnose it, and B, treat it, C, talk to your patients about it? You can't. So I think that's even, an important step for us as attendings, for us as healthcare providers, is educating ourselves and educating our learners too, so that we can begin to have the conversation that's informed.
And as a non-pediatrician, I want to just chime in and say that I think that at this point, most workplaces have some sort of organization with this as their goal. I'm a member of the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and we have an active diversity and inclusion committee that's doing a lot of important work. And I think even outside of medicine, whether, you're an attorney or an engineer or, a member of a neighborhood group, I think that this isn't just limited to medicine. And so it's really important for whatever environment we're in to kind of do our part there.
You're so right. And what's amazing about that is I was at a grand rounds by one of my colleagues. It was amazing. Zoom. We were socially distant. But
of course.
He said, it is no longer courageous to speak out against racism, right? It's just you're almost ostracized if you don't. So for what his example was, just a few years ago, the NFL essentially ostracized Colin Kaepernick, right, for taking a stance, doing a peaceful protest, whatever. And now the NFL has a statement against racism, right? So I think more sectors, business especially, has been active in trying to be in front of this. They have a policy statement against racism. They put something on their website, because now it's if you're not doing it, something's wrong with you, right? So I think you're exactly right. All these sectors are really trying to come to the table.
I love that. And it gets to that point that we are all responsible for this, right? So we're responsible for teaching ourselves, for learning, and then for turning around and doing something about it. And I know I've been heartened, just as you're saying, that there are people who have not been in this space or in this work before that now are. When you look at the protests, you see that. When you look at businesses, we see that. And I think with that, we keep hearing this is not a moment, it's a movement, right? And we really want that to be true. But how do we keep up the momentum? When we're all tired or have competing priorities, or honestly, some people feel traumatized by these conversations. Some people are still uncomfortable with the topic. How would you suggest that we kind of keep up the momentum in this?
Oh, yeah, that is, it's a good question, because I think in some ways, I was talking to a colleague about this, that in some ways, I think our current situation forced us to pay attention. And what I mean by that is coronavirus. I was talking to a colleague and her friend, white attending physician, and we were just talking about this. I was like, that's fascinating. I think you're right. She was saying, essentially, we couldn't go on with our lives. Like work for a lot of people is still at home, schools at home. Like we couldn't just keep on with our lives. Like we were forced to sit and confront, event after event after event.
That's right.
Right. And like, we couldn't look away, we had to like stare at it head on. And I think in some ways the coronavirus, that pandemic mixed with racism as a global pandemic had really created this like petri dish of like just the right kind of conditions to get the momentum that we've seen, because I've been a part of or heard of, witnessed to many protests way before this, right? That like had some traction and then that was it. But this has been the most ongoing, prolonged kind of moment or movement that I've witnessed, and I'm hopeful for that. But like you said, we want to make sure that this is a movement that we're actually pushing towards policy change, because that's where I think the real magic happens and things actually change for people, and not just, some stuff that I put on Twitter or some stuff that I now have on Instagram. So put on Instagram, whatever. But I think especially for those who've been in this work a long time, especially for those who are triggered by these conversations or are painful, I think self-care is so important. And I know that's like this buzzword and everybody talks about self-care, but I really think, you need to make sure that you are feeding your soul, doing things that bring you joy, because otherwise this is tough. This is tough to hear about this every day, to really sit and think about the inequities that exist. It is hard to live and breathe in this work. So I think it's important for those who are in this work to really, really practice self-care. And then for others that are new to it, make sure you carry the torch. While those are sitting, taking a break, getting water, it's your turn to step up. Like, get with it. Let's go, And so to make sure it's a movement, I think we need to think about policy and politics, who we're voting for. But even more local than that, what's happening in our own institutions and our places of work, starting to analyze those policies and push on our school systems. There's been a lot of movements to get police out of schools, out of public schools. And there's a lot of, impetus for that. And so whatever that is, it can be a small thing, but making sure policy change, right? Making sure that those things that have historically disenfranchised people no longer disenfranchise people.
Yeah, I think that is so important. And I think what you said too about, the coronavirus, it's really interesting timing. I wonder too if, so many of us have had more time. Not everyone. I mean, I don't think healthcare workers really have had more time, but there are many people who now, being at home, had more time to actually investigate these inequities. When previously, when everyone's got their nose to the grindstone, maybe it was easier to ignore. And I wonder whether that's part of it too. And just like you were saying, I mean, really, I think the secret sauce is policy work, but it is interesting that, for the past 5 weeks, 2/3 of the titles on the New York Times nonfiction bestsellers list have all been books on anti-racism. And I know that Lurie and I, on our own, we've had trouble finding these titles at any bookstore or any library. So that is, while that's a small thing, it is a change. I mean, I don't know if in history that's ever happened, that 2/3 of the bestsellers list have been anti-racist books, and also like that trend has continued for weeks on end. So I think that I think that's wonderful. And then really the challenge for us is going to be continuing that momentum. But, with that, even though some of these are really hard to find at the moment, we've been sharing recommendations for books and movies and online resources. And like we said, one of our favorites is the CNN Sesame Street Elmo Town Hall, where you were interviewed. I mean, listening to Elmo and Rosita talk about racial justice was just amazing. Like, I had my kids watch the whole thing. But what other recommendations for books or other resources do you have for our listeners, whether they are just dipping their toes into these waters for the first time, or if they've already been immersed in this and have been looking for more?
Oh, that is a fun question. There's so many resources out there now about like anti-racist reading lists. There's a couple of libraries that have published, Ibram X. Kendi's anti-racist reading list. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting at the Cafeteria Table Together, is so interesting because it is by the former Spelman College president, which I went to Spelman, so obviously I'm partial.
Yay!
But it's on the New York Times bestseller list. I don't know. And it came out a long time ago.
It's really
and so
old.
It's very,
yeah.
I'm wondering, and I can't remember then if it was a bestseller. I don't think so, but maybe I'm wrong on that. But I know for her, it's got to be bittersweet that 20 years later or whatever, it's now a bestseller.
Right.
But I think that that's a fabulous book. I've read The New Jim Crow, which I think is fantastic to read. I'm a person who studies incarceration as well. And if you don't believe in racism or racial profiling or difference, you need to read that book. You need to start there at The New Jim Crow. So You Want to Talk About Race is another book, I think, especially for white folks, because this is a Black woman, but she actually is biracial. And she kind of talks about having these conversations with her white mother, right? And her kind of the duality of her identities, which I think is really, really good. Those are for all of the grown-ups, the older folks. For grown-ups who want to have conversations with their kids, I like, there's so many books, but Whiteness, Not My Idea. I think that's what the title is. You might need to double check me on that, but it's Not My Idea, Whiteness. Because it allows you to say, I didn't have anything to do with the construction of whiteness and the social construction of race. And I recognize it's a thing, but it wasn't my idea. So how do I fix it? And that's what I really like about that book. And then for the younger kids, Anti-Racist Baby just came out, Ibram X. Kendi's book. The Sky's the Limit. And if you want to get into more academic books, Stamped from the Beginning is Ibram X. Kendi's kind of seminal book.
Right.
I have to be honest and say I still haven't finished reading it. It is a thick book, and that's it reads like a historian wrote it, because he is. But there's a book called White Rage, talking about essentially white fragility. There's just so many. I have so many ideas.
That's great. As you said, there are so many options out there. So in a way, it's almost like we have no excuse, right? When it comes to educating ourselves, lots of options out there, whether you want to read or watch a movie or, there are lots of ways that we can all educate ourselves, and we all can and should, right? No one person can wake up in the morning and say, I know it all. And we all have a ways to go. As we were saying, it's a journey. Well, I don't know. I've learned so much from you, Dr. Heard-Garris.
Just in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Right.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. This is amazing.
Oh, no, we are so honored to have you and your expertise, and just how much you not only know and share about this, but how much you care. And I think that's so important for all of us who are parents or anyone who, loves children, that it gives me some hope that the future for them will be better and brighter than the, childhoods even that we had. So thank you for that. Thank you for all that you're doing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And bring me back. I want to talk more.
Oh,
later.
Our pleasure.
Oh, for sure. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our audience for listening. Just a friendly reminder, you can follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, and Twitter. Look us up as at Hippocratic Hosts. And please, if you get a moment, review us and like us on Apple Podcasts. We would be forever grateful. And thank you. I think we all have learned from this episode and the previous episode right before this one on race and racism, and we'll all continue to learn more.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to Health at Home with the Hippocratic Hosts. Remember that all views expressed here are our own, not our employers, and all content is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice, nor the establishment of a doctor-patient relationship. Always consult your own physician or healthcare team for any medical issues.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us, subscribe, and tell a friend. And check out our website at www.hippocratichosts.com for show notes on this and all our episodes. Can't wait to chat with you next time.